Welcome back to another episode of the Born Again Again podcast. Today's episode is an interview with Ben and Andrea, a lovely mixed faith couple who navigated Ben's deconstruction together and have been willing to share their story with all of us. In this interview, we talk about those first difficult conversations, about therapy and how that was instrumental for them, and about all the things they learned about themselves and about each other as they went through this life change. In addition, we explore some of the very practical ways in which they have been able to make their mixed faith relationship work for them. I loved this conversation, and I think you will get a lot out of it as well. With all that being said, let's hear from Ben and Andrea, and I hope you enjoy. Hi, you two, and thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having us.
Yes.
Yeah. So I would love it if you could just briefly introduce yourselves and then share kind of where you're each at in terms of your faith.
Let's go first.
You go first.
Me go first? All right. So my name's Ben. I grew up in the Bay Area in California. I say that like I did grow up in church, but I wasn't from a like religious family. Like I went to church when I was a kid, like going to Sunday school and stuff, but no one in my family was super serious about it. And then when I got to middle school, I joined like the, super cool hip youth group they had there. And that was where I like became a Christian. And this was like a suburban white evangelical church.
Sure.
And, I think probably most of our listeners here would recognize a lot of it if they went there.
Yeah.
And that at that point, like I kind of became the most like spiritual person in my family. My dad, not really at all. My mom went every Sunday, but she was not as serious as I was.
Okay.
And so I was like very involved in middle school, very involved in high school, started going on mission trips. When I went to college, I was like, I need to find a Christian group. So I found InterVarsity at the University of Oregon and joined that, was like way into that.
Yeah.
And then I went on staff with them for about 10 years and left staff just, I don't know, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago. Time has no meaning anymore, so I don't know.
Yeah, no, I feel that.
And then I think kind of during that time, particularly after I joined InterVarsity, I started to just become, I think, dissatisfied with kind of like the company line in evangelicalism. And so like I was always drawn to like asking more questions about stuff and like trying to see if the Bible could be like more interesting and more, I don't know, alive is maybe a good word, like than I would experience before. And I think I largely like found that. And I kept being drawn to voices a little more on the outside of things who were like, is it really this, or could it be something else? And who always seemed to me to be people who were more generally like loving towards people who were on the outside a little more.
Sure.
I felt like kind of like Rob Bells or the Rachel Held Evans type people I was drawn to.
Okay.
And through that, you kind of get exposed to different questions and different things come up. And I remember just, I wish I had like a list, like, but I remember like questions and doubts and things would pop up here and there. And I go, that's an interesting thing to think about. I don't know what to do with that. And also I'm full-time employed by a ministry. So like, I don't really want to like deal with this question right now.
Yeah. There's not really space to deal with that in that context.
Because
Sure.
your paycheck is kind of threatened by it amongst like, and also like all of your social relationships and everything.
Yeah.
And I think those started to kind of pile up. And then when I left staff, I kind of was like, my paycheck is not based on what I believe anymore. I had some realization like, I can actually right now decide what I do and don't believe about things. And that was a really big deal to like realize like, I don't have to believe this anymore.
Sure.
If I don't feel that I can. And so I would think to myself like, okay, let's be real. Like, do I think Jesus can like heal someone who's sick? And I was like, honestly, no, I don't. And like, I can actually go like, I don't believe that. I don't have
Yeah.
to like explain that away. I don't have to like make some weird roundabout theological way where it's just not yet, we'll wait, you know, or like God
Yeah.
uses the doctors. But I was like, I just don't think he will. And I realized, oh, even when I was like preaching this stuff and teaching it to people, like I would preach on Jesus feeding the 5,000, but never once did I say, so let's go get our food and see if we can feed your whole dorm with your lunch.
Yeah.
Like, it was always like, oh, you know, your small effort that you make can have a big impact, which is true, but that's not what happens in the story. Like the story is Jesus literally feeds people. And I go, I just don't believe that can happen.
Uh-huh.
And then.
So let me ask a question quick here. So through all this, had you two already been married? And okay.
We
so
met
Andrea, catch me up. Andrea, catch me up a little bit then. I'm like,
sorry, I'm getting
you're in the story. No, that's fine. It's fine.
Yeah. So we've been married for almost 10 years. We met through our work with InterVarsity.
Okay.
And so I guess, 5 years ago was like the halfway point of when we've currently been married.
Yeah.
But then started expressing, I think, more of those doubts or articulating them, or even there was a point where you took a sabbatical and it was pretty clear he wasn't coming back to work for InterVarsity after that. Okay. And I think that's when that's when I experienced you externalizing more of those questions. So.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, that's perfect. So, all right. Yeah. So you're up to that point where, Ben, you've recently started to feel like you're able to express those doubts, or at least like acknowledge them for yourself, maybe for the first time. What did those first conversations look like? Or you're not even there yet? Like, had you guys been talking about these things together, or like, what was that like?
Not really. I don't think we talked about faith and life and because that stuff was like part of our lives and it mattered to us. But as far as me having like serious doubts where I was like, I don't know if I can do this anymore, that wasn't something we were really talking about.
And I think there was a piece going on too, where so much of our connection had been about the external thing that we did together. So there was the faith piece, then we worked together, and that was really normal in our world. Like when we even looked around at other couples, that wasn't just normal. That was kind of like goals to end up with someone in the same industry as you, doing the same thing. And you're just going to ride off into the sunset.
You're this ministry power couple.
Right. You know, like students would look at us like, that's what we want too. Right. And so I certainly didn't know how to ask. I didn't want to know, right, if there was more going on, or Ben had. I didn't want to explore my own questions. And some of it was because it just felt like I didn't feel like I had the tools or even know how to do that, because it didn't fit with the story that we both had seen. And then I think we're trying to live up to in our own relationship.
That makes total sense. Yeah. I mean, you basically have like reached the peak. I mean, I felt like that. Katie and I felt like that, where that's your goal, you know, is to be in ministry together. Both of you are like loving and serving God together. Your whole life is aligned, like work, faith, ministry, everything is just like flowing. Yeah. Yes. I get that. I totally understand that. Definitely.
Like I get to, you know, we get to like plan our like the, you know, group meetings that we're doing, and we get to go to these like big area staff meetings together, and it's like it's just super fun adventure.
Take our baby to China for the summer with a bunch of college students. It was amazing. Actually, that was a great trip, but
that was a lot of fun.
That's besides the point.
Cool. So when did those first conversations between you two actually start happening? Like, when did things start opening up, and how did that feel, those first talks?
I want to say it was a year or two after you left staff.
I think
within those 2 years.
I think that's about right. It was in the time after I left staff, and I don't really remember like what I said. I think there was something where I just knew this was a big deal for me, and I felt like I needed to say it, even though I didn't necessarily have like a fully necessarily thought out, here's why, here's XYZ.
Yeah.
It was like I don't know what I think about this anymore. I'm pretty sure I use a phrase very similar to that.
Well, and so I would
remember
imagine
something different.
No, I was just going to add to it. Go ahead, Joe.
I was just gonna say I would imagine that for Ben, you probably feel like you're going through these thoughts, you're processing all these things, maybe having doubts that you haven't really been able to express to anyone else. What was that like in your relationship? I mean, did it feel like, I would imagine it would feel like you were separated from Andrea in a way, like before you could kind of share all that. Is that true?
I think a little bit. I don't really remember that feeling exactly.
Yeah.
What I do remember is feeling like if I say this, I don't know what's going to happen. Like it felt like a really scary thing to admit.
Yeah.
For all the reasons that Andrea was just talking about, like our whole lives were about this. This is the thing that brought us together. This is like when we pictured what we were going to be doing, you know, for the next few decades, like it was going to be this. And I was suddenly going, I don't know if I can do that.
Yeah.
And it was very scary to even think about saying that out loud to her.
Yeah.
That was also a season where we were just in the throes of having two very young children. I think we had like at that point a 2-year-old, then we had a 3-year-old and a newborn. And so it was easy to not explore.
Not at the same time. That's kind of all happened.
But just that it was, it made it in some ways easier because your life's just kind of full of babies at that point.
Sure.
To not intentionally make space to talk about those things. What I do remember is when you did start articulating things, I will say I did not respond well at all. So when you ask how did it go, I say, Joe, it went terribly. It was very
not
bad.
well.
Not great, Bob.
I remember, we had an idea at some point, I think as we were trying to figure out how do we relate to each other if we're not connected about this, we're like, hey, let's start a podcast for like people exploring this. And we'll just like explore together our own process. But we haven't talked about any of it. So we sit down to record the first episode and we opened with, let's just each share where we're at spiritually. And that was the first time that Ben articulated.
I said, I called myself an atheistic agnostic.
Yeah. Or like a functional, like technically an agnostic, but really functionally an atheist. That was the first time he'd said those words aloud. And what I imagine happened is like color drained from my face. I got very hot. I didn't know what else to say next. Like we just kept like fumbling through this like 45-minute terrible conversation.
Oh my gosh.
And then afterwards, I probably cried a lot. And it was just like, first we realized, oh, hey, here, what it really revealed is, oh, there are all these conversations we actually haven't had together. So we probably have no business having that in front of other people or trying to record that. But that was kind of the beginning of a series of difficult conversation. I just know I didn't know how to engage with your questions or how to process what we were experiencing.
Yeah, I can imagine. So did you actually record that first conversation?
We did.
Oh, we did.
I don't know.
Have you listened to it?
I did like right after we recorded it.
Did you?
But like it's buried in a hard drive somewhere.
That's a treat for another day. You'll find that in 5 years and listen back.
Yeah, that might actually be interesting.
Yeah. Katie and I recently just found a bunch of voice memos on our phone from like 2012 and 2013. And it was just us like talking about random stuff, but it's weird to listen to yourself talk. I don't know. It's weird. Yeah. That'll be a treat when you someday listen to that one.
Have a nice glass of wine, loosen up, and then.
Yeah, right. A couple glasses of wine. So I was going to ask when that bomb was dropped, essentially, when you're recording that podcast, do you remember what your reaction was? I mean, I'm sure there's you had a lot of feelings, I'm sure, but can you articulate that?
If I had to, right, it's kind of tricky because I'm like, what was I feeling in the moment? Because really what I felt in the moment was that like lizard brain, just like fight, flight. I think I froze in that moment is probably what I was experiencing. But I think emotionally, as I think about what I felt in the kind of after time of that, I felt confused. I felt angry. I felt disappointed. I felt sad. On some level, I think I wallowed in a lot of self-pity for a while. Because again, I'm like, I don't know anybody experiencing this. I don't know what to do with this. I definitely wasn't thinking about, I think, how to engage with you or what it looked like to connect with you or what you needed in that. I felt pretty stuck in my own vortex of strong feelings.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I bet. And so you were still working with InterVarsity at that time then too?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So that adds another element into the mix. Yeah.
It did. Yeah, I mean, Ben's departure from that work definitely was the catalyst for my own coming up with an exit plan, because there was a way that I think his questions, while we weren't landing in the same place, I think there was something about his freedom to ask questions that helped me access the questions I had that I had been resistant to or avoiding. But it definitely was a strange experience to go from, hey, we work together, to, hey, I work for this place. And I worked for 5 more years for them, right? As Ben was, I think, being able to articulate with more clarity his own sense of, yeah, I don't believe any of this anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. So that you had that first conversation, which there were a bunch of reactions to. What did those subsequent conversations look like? Like, were you able to talk about it after that? Or was it still kind of a matter of where Ben, maybe you felt like you needed to dish things out more slowly, or like, was it just everything is blown wide open?
I don't remember like exactly. I know that at some point we got to a place where we realized, okay, it's not either of our, like, this isn't going to work if we're each trying to like convert the other person.
Yeah.
Right? Like if I'm trying to go, look, let me tell you how dumb Christianity is, and you come over with me and we'll be awesome agnostic atheist people. And then if she's like, you need Jesus, bro, like let me like, cast this out. Yeah. Yeah, like leaving tracks on my pillowcase. Terrible. So like just kind of getting to the point like that's not going to work.
Yeah.
There has to be something else that we do. Like, and I knew like this is a thing that is important to me, and like Andrea's faith in life is important to her. And so it would kind of suck if that's not still something that we could talk about together. And so we had to figure out a way to do that. And I don't remember exactly how we got there, but I think we landed on a place where it's like, well, we can still be curious about one another. Like, I can know this matters to you and I understand it. So like I can ask questions, and I don't want like your ministry job to be terrible. Like, I don't want to like secretly be rooting for you guys to fail. Like, that sucks. So I can ask questions. I can say, like, hey, how did it go? Like, what did you guys talk about? What are you thinking about? Or like when you would go to church and I'd stay home and I go, oh, how was church today? Like, what did they talk about? You know, and to not go like, to not ask in a way that where I'm just trying to like get in my own thoughts, and I'm just trying to, well, what about this?
Right.
Like,
yeah.
I think that would just kind of make me an ass really more than anything else.
Right.
And then to kind of reciprocate that as well. Like when I do less like functions that like I don't have a structure like church or something where, you know, you can regularly ask how it is, but I do feel like, yeah, we have the like exchange of ideas and understanding one another like has been happening. And when that does, I think it's really great.
And I mean, the thing that really helped in that was going to therapy together. I really feel like our therapist helped us come up with how to create spaces where we could both be curious to one another, even gave us some structure that worked for us to have really intentional conversations that I feel like that was super helpful. Because I remember another conversation along the way where I did go like full apologetic mode, which was very special.
How did that go?
It didn't go well. Again, it was like, I remember Ben had said some things, and in my like, there was no, even though, right, if I was like coaching another person, like, hey, like practice curiosity. You want to be a curious person. Here's how to ask some questions. None of that was going on, right? And what I did was think through like, okay, if I were analyzing the holes in his argument or what he's thinking about,
oh no,
here's what I'd come back with. So I came out with some line about like, oh, so you want to like live in a world with Judeo-Christian values, but you don't want to like believe it. And he was like, what the F, right? Like, it was terrible. And I quickly, like, I remember his response. And what I remember thinking is, I think I've made a huge mistake.
Oh, no.
Just being like, oh, wow, that was terrible. Like, I think I wouldn't wish that on anybody else, but that's what I did, right? Like, that's in my, like, trying to grasp for some kind of, like, let me make this make sense. So personally, I feel like it took, for me, I don't know that you experienced this, but for me, it was being in therapy together where I felt like, one, I was challenged by my lack of curiosity and ability to engage from a place of being curious about Ben's process and being intentional about asking about that. Because it just scared me. And it right. The primary feeling was just like, it would highlight how out of control I felt about lots of things in our life.
Sure.
But it was having a kind of a neutral party that could call that out and then say, okay, you don't have to feel shitty about that. Like, here's some tools to help you learn how to do this. It was helpful.
Yeah.
Oh, no,
the thing we
really helpful.
actually landed on, just to be like more specific about it, we called it sounds dumb, but it was like show and tell, where like we would just take turns, and what we would find, like a podcast or an article or a book or something that we're like, hey, this really meant a lot to me, or I found this was really interesting, and maybe like I'm really connecting with what the people said in this. Would you listen to it? And then we can set a time where we just, in the summer, we just like each grab a glass of wine and go sit out on our back deck and just talk about it and ask questions about it. And, it would be like, okay, so you shared this podcast with me. Why did you like it? And I'd say, well, because I thought I connected with this part and this part and this part. I don't know what I thought about this, blah, blah, blah. And then like turn it over. Okay, as you listened, what were your thoughts? Yeah. And then we just kind of have a conversation. And those conversations were almost always like really good. Like we would walk away going, oh, that was a lot of fun. And feeling like we were really connecting and understanding each other. Like you gave me a book that was about a woman whose husband left the faith, and it was all the things that she dealt with. And you were like, this book really spoke to me. And I read it and I was like, oh yeah, I can see, like, I could start to see what is it like for the person whose spouse changes faith. Like, I've been more focused on like, gosh, what does it mean for me? Like, I don't believe this anymore, but like my whole social circle does, right? But it's like, oh, it's actually really hard for you too.
Yeah. Interesting.
And how can I be more helpful in that? Yeah.
So it sounds like, at least at the point you guys are describing, you're communicating really well, or at least able to communicate well. Yeah. But so from the time you had that first conversation you tried to record up until when you ended up going to therapy, what was the communication like from that point?
I think there were bits and places where it was good and places where it wasn't.
I would describe it as like, we tried. We were trying, like, I think both probably because we come from families that were pretty conflict avoidant. And then I think conflict avoidance was pretty prevalent in the ministry world we came out of too. We just called it other things, right? Like we put a nice
peacemaking.
We put nice peacemaking and shiny labels on it. So I think we got better at, when we did talk intentionally about it, listening, right? Asking questions, trying to like dig down underneath to like, what was the fear or what was the value that was undergirding like what each of us was saying. Yeah. But I think there was still a level to which it felt like kind of fumbling along and even creating a path where we felt like we have no guide for this, right? Like, didn't know other people that were trying to do that, even though statistically there's lots of people in mixed faith marriages, right? Or like that's a very normal thing. Or
suddenly mixed faith marriages.
It was not normal in our world. So it did feel like we didn't talk about it often. We tried to focus on the things we could collaborate on, like parenting, and the things we still enjoyed about our partnership and shared. But I think the intentionality of our conversations really in the last 18 months is what kind of exploded in a good way, I think, with realizing, hey, we need help knowing how to do this.
Yeah.
And as you said, like, there's no, I don't know what you said, there's no guides, there's no examples of it in our life.
Yeah.
Like, it's an interesting thing when you like go over those traditional wedding vows, you're like, oh, in sickness and health, rich or poor, but like never in there is like in faith and in doubt. Like no one is saying, hey, it's possible that one of you might seriously change what you believe about faith and religion and God.
Yeah.
Like that's just not even entertained as an option. And I understand why. No one in the like evangelical world or Christian world like wants to like admit people believe
plan on
this.
That. Right.
And it's actually like okay when that happens.
Of course.
But it does make it so when that does happen, you're like, I don't know what to do. How does this even work anymore?
Yeah. Right. Oh, that's great. So what did the process of looking for and finding a therapist look like? Were you guys both on the same page right away? Like, oh, we should go see a therapist, or what? Did you see a therapist, or was it a couples counselor, or what?
At first, I think she was a therapist, and then she recommended someone who did more work with couples.
Okay.
And so we transitioned, and that was great. I'm really glad that she felt like she didn't feel equipped to help us navigate what we were navigating. But then she recommended someone who was really great.
So we like just gave him a shot, and it was.
I mean, I think we were both on the same page in terms of openness to talking to someone.
We were both very pro therapy, like coming into things.
Okay, that's got to be
all
helpful.
The flaws in the ministry culture we came from. Like therapy was actually very like people were very pro therapy in where we like in our ministry. So it didn't feel weird to say we should see a therapist.
Okay. That was something normal. Like that idea was floated pretty quickly, and you guys are kind of both on board with that pretty quickly. Okay.
Yeah. And we were
that's got to be helpful.
We would have just done it anyway, I think, at some point. Like
someone had given us the advice, like in the guy that married us actually had said, like, you know, he and his wife, they just had made a commitment. They would go every 5 years to check in with a therapist, whether or not there was something going on, just to have another pair of eyes. And help them navigate whatever was coming up at that point.
Yeah.
We definitely missed the 5-year mark, but it felt that advice had just kind of stuck in our heads. Like, hey, if at any point this feels helpful, do it. Don't hesitate on that.
Yeah.
No, that's great. Cause I know I hear a lot of couples who are going through something similar. One partner is deconstructing their faith and the other one wants to hold on to that. And a lot of times communication will just stop or both parties will feel so personally offended or so personally hurt or so betrayed or whatever that like communication just stops completely. And it sounds like in a way you guys may have avoided that stage and kind of kept conversation going, even if they maybe weren't the best at the beginning.
And I think I'm really lucky that Andrea is just generally a like open and curious person.
Except when I was
I was like, I know you enough to know like, okay, this is like you're in the stress of it, like, right. But I get when I hear stories of people who they say like, I don't know if I believe anymore, and their spouse just like flips out because like there's no room for that. And I feel really lucky that as hard as it was, you've said like, kind of you communicate like there's space for that in this relationship. You know, we're working to create this, to make this relationship as safe as it possible for both of us to be where we are and be who we are.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of work from both parties. And I think it does mean that on some level you kind of hold the beliefs a little looser. Because if they are the most important thing that must be held at all costs and must be defended, well, then I don't know how it happens after that. There's people who make it work, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So I don't want to like just project like that's like if it's not like ours, then it can't work. Like I don't know.
Right. Of course.
But I feel really grateful that Andrea was seemed like more committed to the actual relationship than to the ideal of what the relationship was like supposed to be.
I see. Yeah. So what were some of the major, like, I guess, pain points in navigating this mixed faith marriage together? Because obviously you weren't mixed faith at one time and you were kind of both on board trying to create this thriving union.
Yes.
And now that's fractured in some way. What were kind of some of the harder things that you guys had to resolve on each end?
Did you write down stuff about like how you feeling about? Yeah, do you want to do that one?
Yeah. So one of them for me was just the experience of still, for me, valuing going to some kind of worship service, right, or church experience, and suddenly doing that alone was more painful than I thought it would be. Like, even though I would show up in a place, I'm like, nobody cares, right? Like who I am or who I'm with or not with. I still felt this like I felt like every time I walked into the, sanctuary, it was like this, oh, I used to walk in with this other person and now I'm just here and I'm surrounded by other people, but I feel totally alone. And so that was that has been a painful part of just navigating. Like, what does it mean to feel like I am partnered, but I show up to this very significant space in my life and feel very single or alone. That's kind of how I described it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what was helpful in getting over that? Or is that something that's still kind of just continually been a bit painful?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's still been there. I think one of the things, for myself, I think it's made me really think about the way that in the evangelical world, like marriage or being coupled is so like central to like how the programs function or how, right. So I think on one level, it made me think about like, what is this experience like for people who don't have that or want that? Like, what does it mean that is the kind of relationship that's centered in everything that we do? That's kind of, I think I think that's a problem. I just felt more aware of that and more, on some level, like more, I think, empathetic to that experience.
Sure.
It made me want to connect with other people in the community who that was their experience. Like just feel like, oh, there's something I share with you now that we didn't share before. That just felt like an in or a way to connect. The other thing that's happened, I think it opened up conversation for us. And it was actually when I read that book and this author was describing the pain of that experience or how she experienced that to me was the first time I was hearing somebody else articulate that feeling like, oh, that's what I feel too. Oh, that's not weird. Like, it's not weird that I'm experiencing that loss or grieving that. And so I think as Ben and I talked about it, some of where we landed was because his weekend is Sunday and Monday. What would it look like for me to not attend services one Sunday a month? So we get kind of concentrated family time since Sunday's the only day that we're home with all the kids. And then, right, Ben?
Yeah. And then like the church that she goes to, like, as far as like churches that are evangelical adjacent, that are trying to be like really healthy, I go like, I can go to this church once a month. And like, it's really like, I can handle it. I understand that for some people stepping into a church building is like deeply triggering and like a traumatic experience. So for me though, I'm like, I can go to this church once a month. I'm friends with the pastor. I know a lot of the people who are here. I like a lot of these people. If me showing up there once a month is a thing that is like really helpful for Andrea, like I can do that. That's not a problem. And so when we're actually back to in-person stuff, whenever that happens, that's something we're going to implement.
Yeah.
So that's sort of what that was, as we kind of processed that was the compromise of figuring out, well, is there a way to make this work in some ways for both of us? And so that's what we're going to try.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. That's something I didn't really think about, is like literally just like the practical act of going to church on Sundays and the implications of that, and, differences in which partner wants to go and not want to go and stuff like that. I'm generally thinking about like the theoretical, like, existential things and those kind of questions, which I'm sure you guys had that too.
That's so interesting, because I think for me, it was that practical piece that felt the most live. Like, I think I felt really open to like the theoretical stuff. Like, I feel like a lot of what I used to think were like these sacred beliefs, I don't hold them in the same way. Like I hold them much more loosely because I'm partnered with someone whose experience is so different, and that experience has changed how I view belief or how I view that process.
Yeah.
But it was it was that lived practical, just walking in those doors alone that felt the most live, I guess.
Yeah. And I had no idea that you were feeling that way. Like that, I didn't know how hard that experience had become for you until we had that conversation about the book. And that's when you were able to express that. And I was like, oh, I hadn't even thought of that before. And I'm absolutely willing to do something to make that a little less painful, you know? So.
Yeah. And what was the name of that book? It seems like that's probably something people
Blessed Are the Nuns.
It's called Blessed Are the Nuns.
Spelled Nones.
Okay. I'll put a link to that in the description of the notes too. It sounds like that was pretty helpful for you too.
Yeah, it's a good book. It's a memoir, right? So it's definitely not a person who's like, here's how you do it. Here's the answer.
Yeah.
It's like, this happened to me and it was hard. And
here's how we're navigating it.
Yeah.
Sure.
Story form.
Yeah. Were there any other topics or thoughts that were especially hard to kind of resolve between the two of you?
Yes, there were. So,
Yes.
100%, Joe.
You know, as I'm sure many people listen to this podcast know, like when you have a very significant shift in your faith, or if you lose it altogether, like it makes you reevaluate all kinds of things.
Yeah.
You're like, I mean, so for me, one of those ways was in the realm of sex and sexuality. I'm not going to get into like the details of it here.
Sure.
But like, what'll be surprising to probably nobody is that like my views on kind of some of the like sacred cows of evangelical sexuality dramatically changed.
Mm.
And it took a while to like kind of process through things, but I realized that there was one place where I still didn't feel like I could talk to Andrea about it. And I was like, that feels really awful to me, that there's like, we're learning how to talk to each other. There's a lot that like we're connecting. And then there's this huge thing that I just can't say.
Yeah.
And it was really bugging me. It was really weighing on me. And so I, as clumsily as humanly possible, was like, can we talk about this? I remember saying, it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. Don't worry about it. And then when I did, she's like, what the hell? That was a humongous deal.
It's funny now. It wasn't then.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm glad you can laugh about it now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a year and a half of therapy later. We're about it.
Yeah.
But that was really difficult, extremely difficult, because you're revealing a very vulnerable thing, and you know your partner has a like drastically different view and experience, and I don't know what other words I'm throwing there, but just a very different feeling about that particular thing.
Yeah.
And the first several times we tried to talk about it, I'd say we ended up more upset at the end than we did when we started. I think because we would get into the mode where we're trying to convince one another.
And it was just like monologue on top of monologue on top of monologue, like competing monologues. And so
that's never good.
Therapy was, I think, just having someone who could say like, okay, instead of thinking any topic you're going to talk about is like the end all be all that everything rests upon, can we just examine it as not the end all be all, and then build. And again, I don't know, I feel like broken records just saying therapy, but it was like, it was life-changing, really, really was. It was life-changing.
Well, I mean, the fact that you two are able to sit here and talk to me about this and laugh about the hard conversations you have. And you guys look so cute together. And I feel like I just really, it's inspiring. You know, a lot of people go through this and they don't end up feeling the way you do. And it's not that everyone needs to have the same process and everyone needs to stick together and all of that. You know, everyone is on their own journey, but I do feel like you two talking about this is really inspiring, and it makes it seem like, oh, like this can be okay. Like this doesn't necessarily have to be the worst thing in the world. Like we can grow from this. We can still have a relationship. We can still communicate, all of that. So I'm really really happy that you guys are sharing.
Yeah. And in many ways, like the work that we've been doing has been teaching us that this experience has actually like deepened the kind of conversations we have, because there's so much that we just don't take for granted anymore, that we don't just assume, oh, like, well, I'm in this ministry, you're in this ministry, therefore we think XYZ.
Yeah.
We're like, actually, what do you think about that? You know, and it means that you have to go there and you have to name some things, you have to wrestle through stuff. Which, if you can do that well, if you can really learn to listen to the other person, so that they feel heard, and then you feel like you're safe enough to share what you have to say, and you feel heard, like your relationship can really be stronger that way. It takes a lot of work to get there, and I suspect we're going to continue working on that for a long time. But it's a kind of it feels backwards, right? It feels like, oh no, you left faith. That's going to like just damage a relationship. And like, oh, well, actually, maybe it made it a little stronger.
Yeah.
Just because we now have to, there's things we can't avoid dealing with anymore.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. Do you feel like those, those topics that you, Ben, especially maybe had a really hard time bringing up as you're first processing through things, have those conversations gotten easier and like more frequent as time went along?
I would think I would say yes. I don't think it's still not like a, oh yeah, we could just like bring it up and laugh about it and stuff. Like we still, I think, well, I remember bringing something up just a few weeks ago that you had a pretty strong reaction to, and I then had a pretty strong reaction to your strong reaction. And I think we kind of took some breathing time, and then we're like, what just happened there? Something happened.
Yeah.
Let's reconnect and like talk about, okay, when I said this, what happened for you?
Yeah.
And then you're able to articulate, I think it was this, I think I was feeling this way. And I go, okay, yep, I can understand that. Here's how I was feeling. What can we do differently next time? Or something like that. Like, it feels weird to just be vague about it. We do want to be vague about it, but like,
no, that's fine. Yeah. All these things kind of follow a certain cycle, and there's going to be 100 different topics that you have to deal with and you have to talk about as you're going through this faith change. And I think in a lot of ways, you probably approach those conversations in a similar way. And it sounds like the way that you two have been doing it is working, where even if one of you does have a really strong reaction to it, you're able to kind of reel that back in and take a breath and be like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, we're both reacting right now. What's actually like at the heart of what we're trying to communicate to each other. Yeah.
It's one of those, I think, learning to view things like that. I think other guests have maybe said something like this, but like that's just information, right?
Yeah.
Like, having that real strong reaction is just, ooh, something happened. Like, that was a thing.
Right.
What was that?
Yeah.
Rather than going, oh my gosh, you made me so mad. Ah!
Yeah. Yeah.
Just totally, I don't Hulk out like that or anything.
Was that the kind of communication style you two were able to have before your change in faith, or is this something you learned through this process?
I don't think we had some communication skills, because I think we had a pattern with when there was disagreement, we were able to stay in the conversation and get to the point where we could listen, right, and kind of ask the questions and dig underneath. But I don't know how you feel about this. I don't think I was as quick to figure out, like, I'm having a strong emotional reaction. What's going on for me? How do I own that for myself and not kind of spew that out into the interaction? So I felt like, from my end, I'm like, I think what I had been in therapy for myself at other points in my life. So I think I also had this sense of like, well, I know how to communicate. So it was actually super humbling to realize the ways that, like, no, you just take up a lot of space emotionally. You're not vulnerable. You're just very emotive, but that's not the same thing. That I to just own, like, I'm not very good at identifying and paying attention to what I'm feeling and why, and doing my own work first before we engage in conversation. So I didn't do that before this process.
Like, whatever we were doing before, I think we've gotten a lot better at it now.
Yeah.
Like, and maybe the stakes of the conversations can get a little higher now, like where we couldn't necessarily deal with certain levels of things before. And Andrea said like, oh, I realized like I take up a lot of space emotionally. I realized that I would like not take up any space emotionally. Like I didn't know how to have my feelings enter into a conversation, especially if my feelings made you upset. Because then I was like, well, that was bad. Whatever it was that I wanted was bad. So, but I'm learning to go, this is how I feel. And your response to it is not my responsibility, but it matters still. And so we're going to we're learning how to do that. But I don't think we had tools for that before.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's great. It's interesting. So it sounds like, Ben, you needed to learn to be able to take up space for yourself, express your feelings, even if Andrea wasn't going to have a positive reaction to it. And Andrea, you realized that maybe you needed to check your emotional reactions before projecting them on Ben. And now you guys can communicate better because of that.
Yes.
No, that's beautiful. That's great. Are there any, so that obviously seems like a major improvement that kind of came through going through all this. I mean, you'd always hope that when you go through something really hard, you can come out on the other side of it like better than you were in the beginning. Is there anything else that stands out as like ways that your relationship has improved since going through this?
Oh yeah. I mean, I feel like this is related to our relationship, but how we parent or thinking about the kinds of conversations we're
haven't even gotten into that yet.
Like the
kind
of conversations we're having about like, well, how do we make space for our kids to hear honestly from each of us, right? Like how do we model what it looks like to say, well, daddy believes this about this, mommy believes this. No one really knows for sure, but here you have examples of two people that approach it really differently, and you get to decide and you get to explore and figure out. So I don't know what kind of parents we would have been if that hadn't been the case.
Yeah.
But I like the way we're parenting and the way we're, I think, creating openness and space for our kids to figure out who they are and what they think about lots of things.
Yeah.
I don't think that's what I would have brought to our parenting if we hadn't gone through this.
Sure. Yeah. I'm curious, before you went through this, what would have been your plan of raising your kids? I would imagine raising them in the church, probably the same that you both were brought up.
We just both had this big exhale at the same time.
Yeah, I know.
What I think is like pure indoctrination and no like questioning of
that wasn't how we rolled, even when we were both in it.
No, but I think that's because we're both like, we like to critique and analyze and pick things apart. So I think we would have done that. Mm-hmm. But I don't know that we would have had any problem just saying like, yeah, kids, like you're going to, Sunday school or church, and we don't care. I don't know that we would have paid that much attention to what they were being shaped by.
Yeah.
You may feel differently. I don't know how much we would have.
I think it maybe would have been like resigned, just like, and we're going to have to like have them unlearn a bunch of this stuff later to have a more healthy view of Jesus. And like realizing like, if we're going to be part of this church, they're going to get whatever the like crummy kids ministry stuff is.
Okay.
And then we'll have to like, actually, this story of David is a bit more nuanced than this little coloring sheet, would have you believe. And the story of the ark is not a great kid's story, but now I feel pretty comfortable with the like what Andrew said, like, some people believe that, some people believe this, and we have a like children's Bible stories written by Desmond Tutu that they occasionally want to read. Mm-hmm. And I have a reaction. I'm like, oh, I don't want to read this. But I'm like, they want to read it. It's okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, and if they're going to read a children's Bible, I'm guessing Desmond Tutu is probably like a decent person to learn from. They just do funny things. Like our 4-year-old, they have pretty cool painting in our living room of Jesus calming the storm. It's by a Chinese artist. Yeah. It's very stylized. I like it a lot just from a like color and shape perspective. But he he was talking about God, and someone was like, "Who?" And he's like, "That one over there," and he points to the
But then the next sentence he'll just say, Mom, I don't think God's real. I'm like, cool, tell me more about that, right? Like, so it doesn't.
Yeah, okay.
I think that what we've tried with them now is they were when church was a thing that we physically went to, they could come if they wanted, or they didn't have to. It was just like, do you want to spend time with Dad this morning, or do you want to come with me? And mostly it was like they wanted the donut or whatever that was available, like in the after service time. So I think just letting them explore what each of us bring.
Yeah.
I remember being at the library with our oldest a couple years ago, and he like grabbed a book about volcanoes and we're reading that or something, and they talking about like, oh, in the old days people thought the gods did this, and he's like, what does that mean? And I try to explain, and I just go, oh, like, what do you think about God? And he goes, I think he just said like, I believe in God. I'm like, okay, cool. Like, yeah. And we just moved on, and like I was like, I don't want to make a big deal about it one way or the other.
Yeah.
At this point, because they're kids. So
right.
I want them to play and have fun. I don't want them to worry about, do they believe the right things?
Sure. Yeah. So Andrea, was that like a transition you had to make, or like, what about your philosophy in the beginning? Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
Totally. And I would say it's probably a transition I'm still making, right? Because it feels like, I think the expectation, right, if you grow up in the church, which is what I did, is that you're going to you're going to establish your own Christian family. You will raise your children as Christians, right? And like, that is the definition of being faithful, right? Like, so I think I remember even being in a meeting at the church I'm a part of now. It was it's small. There's I don't know what to call it, like the kids ministry. It was going through a lot of transition. So they're asking what families wanted. And we had all submitted ideas via email. And I said something about like avoiding fundamentalism and how the kids were being taught. And I watched another couple just like give each other like side eye at each other. Like, it was very much like, what does that mean? Right. Like, that's how I interpreted it. And I was like, oh, like, I'm the heretic in your midst, right? Like, that's what it felt like. But I think it has been a transition to think like, well, what I want more than anything is for my kids to be free to figure stuff out. And I didn't have that process as a kid. And so, it's a transition, because that's like, you're in the world I come from, you're supposed to be scared of that. That's the most terrifying thing you could do, right? You're actually being a bad parent potentially. So I think there's still a residual level of that I have to like press through in myself, or just letting go of like, well, that's the story I was told. I don't think that needs to be the story that I live in. It was a huge transition.
Okay. Yeah. That makes total sense. I'm curious, for you, Andrea, as well, do you feel like going through this process, and it sounds like your faith has shifted some, at least.
Yeah.
Do you feel like it's enriched your kind of Christian experience, or has it minimized it? Or I'm just curious how you feel about
I do think it has enriched it.
Okay.
I remember a couple years ago, it was my turn to have a 6-month sabbatical. Ben by this point is gone from InterVarsity, but I'm still there. And I decided to meet with a spiritual director once a month to just process through my life. And I chose somebody from a Catholic background because I wanted to interact with someone who came from a different tradition than me. And we talked about lots of things over those, one meeting a month for 6 months. And at the end, I said like, hey, here's this other thing that's going on in my life. Like, my husband has deconstructed his faith entirely and no longer has a faith. Like, my faith has, shifted. We used a lot, the language in those sessions was a lot about how my frame for what faith looked like, or what relationship with the divine looked like, was getting rebuilt in a bigger way, in a more expansive way.
Yeah.
And I just remember her looking at me at the end and saying like, I think this is so good. Like, think of the frame like your kids will have because of the relationship that you're in, like, because of the way you are getting to navigate both of you in your own ways, like mystery and uncertainty in a way that like you weren't allowed to do, right, as you were growing up, Andrea. And for me, that was that's the picture that I go back to of how this has enriched my sense of my own Christianity or attempting to follow Jesus, is that it does feel like just a bigger frame that is expansive and continues to become more expansive. And that instead of that being, not that it hasn't been without like fear, like I think if I had a kind of a default emotional response throughout this process, it's probably been being afraid. But I think in walking through those and continuing to connect and work through things together, my experience is that like I'm grateful for the life we have and the partnership we have and the way that our relationship makes room for my faith journey to be a thing and for Ben's journey to be a thing, and that can still, it's not just even coexist. It's like those things can thrive alongside each other and even collaborate in ways that have been really good.
Yeah, we definitely aren't like, we don't just tolerate each other.
Yeah.
Like we genuinely enjoy each other's company and genuinely enjoy like learning more about the other person.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. I feel like we could talk about this for so much longer, but in the effort of keeping it around an hour, I'll just end with one more question for you two. If you could go back to yourself right when you started kind of having these doubts, Ben, right before you started having these conversations, what would you have done differently, if anything?
That feels hard. I think just to like be aware that as hard as this process like was for me, it's also really difficult for Andrea. And that doesn't mean that I need to be like less upfront about what's going on, but it means that like this is going to be a hard process for both people. And like I think it's weird. I'm going to like throw the Christian-y phrase, but like have grace for each other. Like we're not going to be at our best at times. We're going to say things that hurt. We're going to not know how to respond in ways that are helpful, and just to like both stay in it and listen to the other person as much as possible. I think that's probably what I would do. Yeah, no,
that's a great answer. That's great. Well, I really, really appreciate you two coming on. Like I've said a number of times, I think we get a lot of emails and stuff from couples who are despairing, going through this process and are lost and feel, like I said, feel betrayed, and communication has come to a standstill. And it's a really hard thing to go through. And I know it was hard for you two as well. But like I said earlier, I think even just you two being able to sit here and like laugh about the old conversations you have, and I can see your connection together, and I can hear it in your voices and the way you look at each other. It's just, I think anyone listening should have hope.
We basically haven't broken eye contact this entire time.
You're just facing each other, just staring down. It's a little weird, but it's fine.
Super weird.
But yeah, I really appreciate your vulnerability and just being willing to share what you shared. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks again for inviting us to be on. It really, I don't know. I feel like it actually feels like it just feels kind of fun to be able to like recount some of the journey and realize, we will continue to learn and grow, but there's been a lot of good growth in the last few years.
Yeah. Sounds like it.
And if people in the Born Again Facebook group, like want to reach out to us, if they want to talk for whatever reason, like I'm in there all the time. So like you can find me there, and I'm happy to. I want people to be able to feel like there is hope for their relationships if that's what their relationships need. And if in any way we can be helpful, like we would love to be. We obviously don't have all the answers, but like happy to lend an ear.
Awesome. I'm going to go on record too and say that you two definitely should start a podcast because I would listen to that podcast. And I think you'd have a lot of people who follow along as well. So yeah, go
Definitely
for it.
probably a healthier place to maybe explore that potential.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thanks.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
so much, Joe.